So as far as black beans, a similar type size trial to our navy beans with 29 entries. We did only have 9 commercial entries into our black bean trial and 20 experimental. Average yield was really impressive on blacks this year. I bolded that top here on location there, and that is a correct number. That trial averaged over 40 bags per acre across all 29 of these entries, both commercial and experimental. So we really pulled some exceptional yield potential out of that trial this year. When we look at these averaged across all 4 of those locations, we do see a few of our new ones to the right that we're often talking about have grouped together statistically and in that 90th percentile. This BL 14500 is an experimental from Provida that we've documented as having some really exceptional yield potential, and it didn't let us down this year, averaging somewhere in that 3,700 pounds per acre across all locations. But however, that did also group with Spectre, which is one of our commercial varieties that's rolled out in the past couple of years and really picked up some traction statistically. However, Blackbeard, which is another new one that growers have adopted fairly readily, is very close to both Spectre and a little farther behind 14500 in yield. But we're also seeing a new one from MSU that's in that conversation very much as well, and that's Adams. And Adams was tested under B18504 previously as an experimental number, and this does carry resistance to anthracnose race 109. So that's really an added benefit to that Adams, along with this exceptional yield potential, is to help guard us genetically against anthracnose. Before I do move off of this slide, I would like to make one comparison that we looked at. First, I'll draw your attention to Zorro here in the center. This is often the standard that we're using. Still a very good bean. We averaged over 3,000 pounds per acre across all 4 of those locations. We also tested a comparison of Zorro with heads-up seed treatment. We did not see a lot of white mold this year in these trials, but we did not see a positive response from adding heads-up seed treatment to Zorro compared to Zorro planted alone with just our standard seed treatments. So we'll move on to look at that 3-year average again. Once again, as yield as a percent of a check. So what we're comparing to here is Zorro. And as we move to our right, this is all percentages better than Zorro. So if we look at this group here, grouped in the Bs with Zorro, Black Bears, Zenith, and Black Tails, we group those together statistically the same across those 4 locations in 3 years. Numerically, it looks like we have about 4% more yield out of Black Bear, Zenith, and Black Tails than we do Zorro. But then we really get into our next group of newer releases here with Adams, Spectre, and Blackbeard grouping together there in that A range with about 4 to 6 bag advantage over Zorro. And once again, we have some of these traits such as anthracnose resistance and some improved plant architecture as we look at these in our new releases. So if we take a look at what these actually look like, we have Zorro here ranked at number 7 as our standard. On our right, we have Black Bear at number 6. We had those comments on maturity a little bit in our previous conversation, and we can definitely see the difference in maturity here between Black Bear, one of our newer ones that does push that maturity a little bit longer than our older standard of Zorro here on the left. And Black Bear does dry, it just needs a little bit longer than our Zorro does. Ranked at number 5, we have Zenith from MSU. At number 4, we have Black Tails. Black Tails can lose structure on us a little bit. However, it did look pretty good this year. And has maintained, in that group with Zenith, Black Bear, and Zorro. And then we'll move into our, top that A group with Adams ranked here at number 3. This is pictures of it on both the left and right. You can see we have pretty good architecture here. It's not quite as pretty as some of the lines we've seen, but you can definitely see the pod set that we do have in there. It's carrying a lot of yield potential for us without a doubt. Then we have Spectre. We do have a little bit earlier picture here as it's starting to dry down, but we have the end result here on the left. Spectre has maintained some pretty good plant architecture and resistance to lodging, and also some pretty good scores as far as white mold tolerance in comparison to some of our other entries into the black market trial. And then the top yield ranker in that 3-year trial would be Blackbeard. Blackbeard has a pretty distinct type structure to it. As we look at it here on the left, you can really tell how upright it is, and it sets pods pretty high. We'll talk a little bit more about Blackbeard farther, but it definitely has been a pretty impressive bean for us, carried some yield potential, and has some pretty good structure as long as it doesn't get too growthy. So we have some lodging and white mold infection scores that we actually took under irrigation in Montcalm County. So I like to utilize this location to look at some of these things as we really apply, a good amount of nitrogen and a good amount of water to these beans to elicit that growth and really push the envelope of that plant architecture to maintain that resistance to lodging, white mold tolerance, and also see what we end up with for yield for these. So scored on a scale from 0 to 5. We looked at lodging. The one thing you'll look at is when you compare this graph here of Adams, Black Bear, Blackbeard, Spectre, and Zenith to our white mold infection, taken on 0 to 100, they maintain a similar type trend as we look across those, as that plant architecture is closely linked to how tolerant we keep these beans of white mold. We see that, Adams, Spectre, and Zenith were our top performers this year as far as tolerance, keeping under 40% type infection, where Black Bear and Blackbeard did struggle a little bit more in that 50 to 60% type infection. When we do look at yield, we did have a little bit of a surprise here with Black Bear. It did get relatively high scores for white mold, but it did produce a lot of yield under that irrigation, maintained decent structure. Adams also did very well along with Spectre, and then Blackbeard did fall off a little bit on yield compared to where we typically see it under some of our dry land conditions. But we'll show what happened to that plant architecture here in a photo pretty soon. And then Zenith was a little bit behind, which we would expect based on our 3-year averages of general yield potential. We believe that Blackbeard, Spectre, and Adams do have a yield advantage over Zenith.
Hey Scott, this is Dan. Hey, on these, when you plant that out in Montcalm County, you still in that 20-inch rows or 22-inch rows out there also when you're doing your white mold study?
Correct. These are in 20-inch rows under irrigation. And okay. Something else to keep in mind is, this is in a commercial field of dark red kidneys. So your irrigation schedule for dark reds is a little bit different than it would be if you were raising blacks in that field. And that can lead us to push this white mold infection on these. And that's something of interest to us and something of why I keep putting those blacks there. Because you like to see them when you get that rain that you can't quite stop. How do they perform under those situations? So then to have a look at these, we have our first one here of Adams. You can see we did get some mold in there if you look close, but overall it's performed pretty well and maintained structure. These border rows here are our Zorros that we use as a kind of comparison check. Next we have Blackbeard, and this we had a little bit of struggles with. You can see how much this Blackbeard lost its plant architecture there when we got too growthy. It ended up lodging on us a little bit, got a little too tall, and actually ended up looking like a shorter plant canopy than these Zorros next to it, which we know typically is not the case. When you look down into that plant, that white mold infection was pretty obviously in there. It ended up being about 60% infection across the plot. And looking at Spectre, maintained its architecture a little bit better than Blackbeard did, more comparable to that Adams under this irrigated condition. So then we'll shift gears a little bit and I'll talk some more about our fertilizer trials on black beans. So a major focus I had this year was looking at nitrogen rate and the potential interaction with plant populations. For this, we had 12 treatments. These 12 treatments were at 4 locations with 4 different nitrogen rates. nitrogen rates were different at each location based on a few different things. In Bay, we range from 0 up to 50 pounds per acre applied in a 2x2. Huron, we were 0 all the way up to 100 pounds per acre applied in a 2x2 with 28% liquid fertilizer. And Sanilac and Tuscola, these two were the same. Our base here was 40 pounds based on what the grower had already broadcast and incorporated ahead of time. Then we went up from there of adding, another 10 pounds of liquid fertilizer at planting, to get that 50 pounds up to 70, and then our final rate all the way up at 90 pounds per acre. Each of these fertilizer rates were tested across 3 planting populations, planted at 100, 130, and 154,000 plants seeds per acre. The first one we'll talk about is what we found as far as populations. This was a pretty simple one, as plant population did not significantly affect yield at all locations except for in Huron County. In Huron County, we did see that populations, emerged populations, what we actually had out of the ground at harvest, we did see a positive response, of 92,000 and 102,000 plants per acre compared to our 77,000 plants per acre across all fertilizer treatments. So there was a benefit to having a few more plants in the ground at that location. Once again, I'll have you guys look at what our axis is here though. This is pounds per acre. So even if that 77,000, we were in that 32 bag type neighborhood across all fertilizer treatments, from fertilizer treatments of 0 all the way up to 100 pounds per acre. Where at that 92,000, we brought that yield up a little bit, but we were knocking on the door of 40 bags per acre with that 92,000 plants per acre. Then we'll talk about what response we actually elicited from fertilizer. This photo was taken over in Bay County with our 0 pound check on the left and our 50 pound top end rate on the right. And you can clearly see we do elicit a yield, or not a yield response from this, but a plant biomass type visual response from that increased rate of nitrogen fertilizer, which can have some implications with white mold, which we'll talk about a little later on. So to look at what this added up to here in Bay County, we did get a positive yield response from adding nitrogen to those dry beans. 0, 10, and 30 were not significantly different. However, when we got up to 50 pounds per acre, we did get a positive type response. And we see the same trend in Huron County, except we're a little more drawn out here across our treatments. With our 0 pound check coming in just over 30 bags per acre, our 20 and 60 grouped together in that 35 to 37 type range. And then at 100 pounds per acre, we did bump that all the way up to about 42 bags per acre. In Sanilac County, we elicited the same type response, but it's important to remember our base here was 40. So between 40 and 70, we did not see a positive type response. And when we pushed up to 90 pounds per acre, we did bump that yield a little bit from that extra applied nitrogen. And in Tuscola, we did not see significant differences between 40 and 90 pounds per acre of applied nitrogen. So the takeaways from this year's testing is yield did respond to increased rates of nitrogen in absence of white mold. So that's really our key caveat with this trial. We know that increasing nitrogen rates on beans, can increase plant growth and can result in more beans per acre. However, when we have an issue like this that comes in of white mold infection, that larger plant is generally less tolerant to white mold infection and can lose our architecture. And then we end up with plants that lodge and a white mold issue that can really bite us. So this will be something we're going to continue to work on in future years to really help narrow down where we should be in our N rates. And we looked at plant populations. Most often, plant populations above 70,000 plants per acre did not significantly affect dry bean yield when we were in that neighborhood of average type production of 25 to 32 bags per acre. We get above that, there might be some benefits to having a few more plants in the ground, but over most cases, 70,000 plants per acre were significantly the same. So then the question we get is about what about lower populations? when we get into actually some stand loss issues and replant decisions. So we did put out one trial looking at some lower populations. From 117,000 was our top end of actually, plant population at harvest, all the way down to 39,000 plants per acre. So that's getting pretty low. That's about a plant and a half per foot in 20-inch rows. And what we did find is that 117, 78, and 65,000 plants per acre grouped together significantly. And then our 39,000 plants per acre and 65,000 did group together as well. But overall, it still is pretty impressive of where we ended up on this yield axis. Even with 39,000 plants per acre, we averaged just over 25 bags with those. The important thing to keep in mind is that this was even stand loss. That was plants that were, thinned evenly. It wasn't, a low spot affecting population or something like that. But we can pull some pretty good yields from relatively low plant stands when they are even. With that, I'll take any questions that you guys may have on our 2020 black bean research. Yeah, Amy.
Hey Scott, it's Amy Sweeney. Hey, in order to help growers try to figure out where that nitrogen level is, because that's quite a range that you presented, would pre-side dress nitrate tests be a helpful tool?
Yeah, so that's a great question about pre-side dress nitrate test. So that's something we've been working with Kurt Steinke on and hopefully validating a little bit of whether that can be a beneficial tool for us. Because we're often finding there is a wide range of response of where we should be in that nitrogen range, and it can vary greatly based on a grower's rotation and past management of where they're at, and hopefully managing those nitrates to the best of our ability. So as of today, we can't quite say, but hopefully that's something that's coming in the future to have a managed prescription, so to speak, to make sure we're where we're at. Is where we need to be for optimal production and disease management.
Great. Thanks, Scott.
Scott, this is Keith Artis. I believe the Blackbeard Inspector have good color retention. Do you have any knowledge or information on the Adams and 14500, how they're rated for color retention?
Yeah, great question, Keith. So as far as color retention, we look at some of those other blacks. Adams has acceptable type color retention at canning. It's not quite what we see with like a Zenith, which is that really black color. It's more similar to a Zorro, so definitely acceptable type color retention, but not quite a new standard. With the BL 14500, I would say it's fairly comparable as well. It's not as brown as, say, a black bear can get. I would say it's a little better than possibly black bear, but within that acceptable range of retention with our black standards.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions before we talk about small reds?
Scott, Steve Ewald, regarding organic production and not really specific to black beans, but some of these varieties, when they stay green, obviously we've got to leave them in the field a little bit longer so we can get a good quality sample at harvest. But in some of the black beans, we've noticed that as you leave them out there, under certain conditions, the pods start to pop and release the seed.
Mm-hmm.
And is there any indication that some of these beans might be better at keeping a pod closed as they dry down? Because we do have to leave them out there.
Right. That's a great question, Steve, of how well they weather. Unfortunately, I don't have a really great answer for that. I guess that it's kind of a double-edged sword. Fortunately, we harvested everything in a really timely manner this year, finished up by early October, which is where we like to be. But on the flip side, it doesn't really give us a chance to see how well those beans do stand a little bit longer. So unfortunately, I don't have a great answer, Steve.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Scott,
Yeah.
Neil French.
Hi, Neil.
Question I have on the harvesting of the population that we show at harvest population. Do you know what planting population was, and did we lose a major amount of beans during the growing season?
Yeah, so as far as the difference between our planting populations and our harvested populations, we do tend to lose quite a bit depending on environmental conditions, but most of it would be in that first 2 weeks following planting, based on what stand counts that I've conducted. It can be somewhere in that neighborhood of 30%, based on what your germ was to start, and then some of the loss you get based on soil compaction and crusting and those sort of things. So those trials I showed where we had some really low populations, we actually went out and thinned them by hand about a week after planting, as soon as they start to emerge. And then from that point on, we maintained populations pretty well. So we didn't lose a lot. However, we didn't have a lot of late season root rots or anything like that come in, where that can significantly impact what our stands do look like, from more of a mid-season stand loss perspective.
So you actually went out and thinned the crop to get the population down. It wasn't just the nature of the crop growing then.
Right. Yep. Those
Okay.
are mechanically thinned. The
Gotcha.
lowest we can plant with our planter is about 100,000 per acre. But we always do want to know about those lower populations when we do have an issue. So that's where we went out and mechanically thin those.
Very good. Thank you.
Are there any other questions before we wrap up?
Scott, again, Keith, I don't know if this is the right spot for this question, but BASF has been toting that Outlook is supposedly the only labeled product that you can apply post-emergence on early dry beans for lay-by treatment for water hemp weed resistance management. Have you seen or experienced with that question?
Yes, that's a great question. And yeah, that is something they've brought up to us. And Christy Sprigg had actually put out some trials about mid-season this year, looking at what type of crop injury response we might have from that. There is some older data that displayed, some injury to Outlook in those lay-by type applications. But that's something we want to revisit here. It appears that there might not be too much injury from those applications, but it's something we definitely want to be a little cautious of how quickly we move into using Outlook as a lay-by application. It certainly would fit the script if we can get away with it without too much crop injury for that residual control of water hemp, because like you said, that is the only option we currently have for that in-season application. Which could have some additional benefits to us. We've had some really difficult years of weed control at times without that, in-season residual control of getting from our pre to our post. And then if beans don't close canopy, we've had some issue with some weeds getting away. If we could extend that residual a little bit farther into our growing season, that would definitely be helpful and an attractive option for weed control.
Thank you.